Hey everyone, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. We're diving deep into music production techniques today. You sent over some really interesting articles and guides, and it seems like you're really ready to kind of level up your skills and just become more efficient overall,
Mhm.
get that workflow going.
Yeah, you've got a really great mix of sources here. And it's cool because they all focus on like the techniques that can like really elevate your sound.
Hmm.
But what I find really interesting is they also spend a lot of time talking about, like the why behind the techniques.
Hmm.
And they encourage you to like really think critically about your choices and
Yeah.
to like really, really trust your ears.
Yeah, I love that. And speaking of choices, one thing that comes up a lot in these guides is compression. And, I think we all kind of know it's important, but it can be a bit of a mystery sometimes. Like, have you ever felt like you're just tweaking knobs, hoping for the best?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a tool that can be misused. A lot of producers, especially like when they're starting out, they just kind of slap a compressor on everything without
Right.
really understanding what it's actually doing. And these sources do a good job of like breaking down the fundamentals, like how compression essentially reduces the dynamic range. So it's smoothing out the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts of the sound.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then there's all this talk about attack and release settings. What's the deal with those? I always feel like I'm like second guessing myself when I'm adjusting those.
Those are super key for shaping the character of your sound. Like imagine you have a vocalist and they have like a really dynamic performance. So you can use a fast attack on the compressor and that'll grab those initial peaks really quickly and it prevents them from being like too harsh. Then a slow release will kind of gradually let the volume come back up. It's like this nice, smooth, polished sound, almost like a gentle hand on the volume fader.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about making things louder, it's about shaping the sound.
Exactly. And that's especially important in electronic music because electronic music tends to have like a much wider dynamic range than other genres. Actually, one of your sources mentions using a gain reduction of like 10 dB or even more on some electronic tracks. Like, can you imagine doing that on like a delicate acoustic recording?
Whoa, that seems like a lot. Wouldn't that make everything sound like super compressed and lifeless?
It definitely can if you're not careful. And that's why all these sources are stressing like the importance of finding that sweet spot. You want to control the dynamics just enough to create a tight, impactful sound without squashing all the life out of the music. And this is where that trust your ears advice comes in. Like you got to let the compressor breathe, you know, adjust that threshold, play with the ratio.
So it's all about balance. Now, you mentioned electronic music, and that makes me think about something else these sources talk about. Analog warmth. Is that just a fancy way of saying that, like, we all miss vinyl records?
Well, there's definitely some nostalgia there.
Yeah.
People often associate that warmth with like vintage analog equipment, like you said, like tape machines, tube amplifiers. But what's so cool is now we can like emulate those characteristics in the digital domain using plugins.
Right.
Well, think about it like this. A tape machine adds these like subtle harmonic distortions and saturation to the sound. And that gives it that like characteristic warmth and cohesiveness. It's almost like the instruments start to kind of melt together in a pleasing way. And so Toe Tape 7 tries to recreate those sonic characteristics and kind of enrich your digital recordings with that vintage vibe.
Yeah.
And they suggest using it subtly on buses. It's almost like you're adding this warm blanket over your whole mix.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. It's not just about making things loud, it's about adding that subtle texture and depth.
Precisely. And speaking of loudness, we all want our tracks to hit hard right. But one source cautions against relying solely on limiters to achieve that. They suggest exploring something called clipping.
Clipping, isn't that a bad thing? Like when the audio signal gets all distorted?
Well, it can be if it's not done carefully. But controlled clipping can actually be a really effective way to increase the loudness while potentially preserving those transients. Those initial bursts of energy that give your music impact.
So how does that work?
Basically, clipping shaves off the peaks of the audio signal. So this allows you to boost the overall level without introducing those artifacts that you might get with like heavy limiting. It's a more transparent approach,
Yeah.
especially if you're aiming for a really loud in-your-face sound. They even recommend a specific plugin called Sir Standard Clip for this, and they suggest using it before your limiter in the mastering chain.
Wow, this is opening up like a whole new world of possibilities. So we've got compression, analog warmth, and clipping. Anything else I should be adding to my sonic arsenal?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful techniques they talked about was parallel processing. Have you ever experimented with that?
I've heard the term, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it works or like when to use it.
Well, it's actually simpler than it sounds. You basically create a copy of your audio signal, and then you Apply effects to that copy, and then you blend it back with the original. Think of it like adding a secret ingredient to your recipe.
Okay, so it's like having two versions of the same track, one with effects and one without, and then you blend them together.
Exactly. Let's say you want to add some serious punch to your drums, but you don't want to make them sound completely squashed. You could send a copy of your drum track to a separate channel, apply some heavy compression, and then blend that compressed signal back in with the original. And then you get that punch of compression without losing like the natural dynamics of the original drums.
One of the sources was talking about volume automation, and they presented it as like a more transparent way to control levels compared to like relying solely on compression.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, while compression can be a super powerful tool, if you overdo it, it can kind of suck the life out of your music.
Yeah,
And volume automation lets you fine-tune those dynamics with way more precision. It's almost like you're writing the faders throughout the whole song.
yeah. I can see how that would be like super useful for vocals, especially.
Exactly. One source even specifically suggested automating vocals up during those quieter sections instead of just adding more compression. And that way you can ensure the clarity without sacrificing the natural dynamics of the performance.
Makes sense. Any recommendations for tools to handle this?
Oh yeah, one of the sources mentioned Synopsys Free G as a really fantastic plugin for volume automation. And the best part is it's free, easy to use, and it's super versatile.
Free is always good. Okay, so we're getting those levels dialed in, but what about making our tracks sound more, well, interesting?
Sound design. A couple of the guides really stress the importance of experimenting with timbral layering to create those like richer, more complex sounds,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that layering is key, especially with synths. But how do you actually like go about doing it? It seems like it could get muddy so easily.
It's all about finding that balance between different sonic textures. So instead of relying on just one single synth patch, try like blending several together, each with their own unique characteristics. Like imagine combining like the warmth of an analog synth with the crispness of a digital one. They even suggested using a high-pass filter on the upper layers to prevent them from clashing with the lower frequencies.
Ooh, that's a great tip. So it's kind of like you're creating this sonic tapestry, like weaving together those different sounds to create something unique.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about analog warmth earlier? Well, that can actually play a role in timbral layering too.
Hmm.
You could layer like a slightly saturated sound with a cleaner one to add depth and dimension.
Cool. One thing I always struggle with is making drums sound less robotic
Yeah.
and more human, you know? It's like they're just marching in perfect formation, no soul.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And thankfully, your sources had some great tips for injecting that natural feel and swing into those drum patterns. One of the analogies they used was to think of it like a group of musicians playing together and how they're not going to hit every note perfectly in sync.
Hmm.
There's going to be subtle variations in the timing and intensity.
So how do we translate that to our digital productions?
Well, they suggest like experimenting with MIDI swing settings, to introduce that rhythmic displacement, varying the velocity of those individual hits so you create dynamic accents, and even like manually nudging notes off the grid so you can break away from that rigid quantized feel. They also recommended like slightly delaying the hi-hats and percussion behind the beat for a more laid-back groove. It's crazy how like a tiny little adjustment like that can make a huge difference.
This is really making me rethink how I program my drums. Speaking of technical details, we need to talk about spectral shaping. That sounds super complicated, but I'm guessing it's probably not as scary as it sounds.
It's not that bad. It's really about precision in your mixing. So instead of using static EQ cuts, which can sometimes remove too much energy from the sound, you can actually use tools like dynamic EQ or multi-band compression. And these give you more surgical control over specific frequencies. It's almost like having an EQ that only kicks in when it's needed.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like a smart EQ that targets those problematic frequencies without affecting the whole signal.
Exactly. One of your sources recommended Soothe 2 as a really powerful plugin for this. It's designed to automatically tame those harsh frequencies without over EQing. Imagine having a virtual assistant that smooths out those rough edges in your mix. And they specifically suggested using it on the mids and highs to kind of preserve that clarity while removing any unwanted harshness.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together. We've talked about so much already, but I know there's more. What else do these guides have for us?
Well, one thing they all emphasized was the importance of mixing at low volumes. And I know it can be tempting to crank it up, But listening at lower levels actually helps you make better decisions, and it avoids ear fatigue. It's kind of like trying to taste the subtle flavors in a dish. You need that quiet environment to really appreciate them.
That's a great analogy. It's so easy to just get carried away and blast the music, but I can definitely see how that could lead to some not so good mixing decisions. Do you think that also has something to do with how our ears perceive different frequencies at different volumes?
Oh, absolutely. Our ears are most sensitive to those mid-range frequencies.
Mm.
And so when we listen at loud volumes, those frequencies can overpower the lows and highs, and then it makes it really hard to judge the overall balance of the mix.
So mixing at a conversational level and taking breaks is key. It's like giving our ears a chance to reset and come back fresh. I'm feeling so inspired after exploring all these techniques with you. We've covered everything from compression and analog warmth to spectral shaping and referencing. But what's really stuck with me is how it's all about finding that balance between like technical precision and creative expression, between using your ears and, utilizing those visual tools.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just about knowing the tools, it's about knowing like how and when to use them effectively to achieve like your own unique sonic vision.
Right. And speaking of sonic visions, I wanted to circle back to something we briefly discussed earlier, timbral layering. I'm still a little fuzzy on how to do it without creating a muddy mess.
Remember, it's like building a sonic tapestry. Each layer should have its own distinct character and its own space in the mix. Think of it like the different elements in a painting. You have your foreground, your middle ground, and your background. Each element contributes to the overall composition, but without like overwhelming the others.
Okay, yeah, that visual analogy really helps. So it's not just about stacking sounds on top of each other. It's about choosing sounds that complement each other and then like placing them strategically in the mix.
Exactly. And one of your sources had a great tip for like preventing muddiness when you're layering sounds, using a high-pass filter on the upper layers. So this allows the lower frequencies of those foundational sounds to shine through while preventing those higher frequencies from clashing and creating that cluttered sound.
That makes sense. So it's like giving each layer its own frequency range to play in.
Yeah. And another key aspect of layering is experimentation. Don't be afraid to try unconventional combinations. One source even mentioned blending digital and analog synths together to create these like unique textures. It's all about pushing those creative boundaries and discovering new sonic possibilities.
That's what I love about music production. There's just like endless possibilities for creating something new and exciting. Speaking of exciting, we talked about how to make drums sound less robotic and more human. I'm ready to inject some serious groove into my beats.
Remember that analogy of a group of musicians playing together. They don't hit every note perfectly in sync. There are those subtle variations in timing and intensity that give the music that human feel. And your sources highlighted several techniques to achieve this in our digital productions.
Yeah, like using MIDI swing settings to create that rhythmic displacement.
But honestly, I still feel a little unsure about nudging notes off the grid.
I know, I know. It might feel unnatural at first, but it's a super powerful way to break free from that rigid, quantized feel. Imagine a drummer playing a live groove. They're not going to hit every single beat perfectly on the grid. They might rush some hits, drag others, and add subtle variations in velocity to create a more dynamic performance. And that's what we're trying to emulate in our digital productions.
So it's all about those subtle imperfections. Those are what make the music breathe and groove. And I remember that cool tip about delaying the hi-hats and percussion slightly behind the beat for a more laid-back feel. Yeah. It's amazing how such a small adjustment can make a world of difference. And remember, these are just starting points. The real magic happens when you start experimenting and like developing your own unique style.
This whole deep dive has been like an amazing reminder that music production is a constant journey of learning and exploration. What final thoughts did these guides leave you with?
They all emphasize the importance of embracing the process. Music production is not a destination, it's a journey. There will be challenges, there will be frustrations, but there will also be moments of like pure joy and creative fulfillment.
I couldn't agree more. It's about constantly pushing yourself, trying new things, and never being afraid to experiment.
And remember, there's no right or wrong way to make music.
Yeah.
What matters most is that you're enjoying the process and you're creating something that you're proud of.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm super excited to apply these techniques to my own productions.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Remember, music production is a lifelong journey of learning and discovery. So keep experimenting, keep exploring, and keep those speakers pumping.
Great advice. Thanks for joining me on this sonic adventure. Until next time, happy music making.